Let us put ourselves in the holy presence of the Lord.
Heavenly Father, sovereign God, who is all-knowing, powerful, whose dominion is eternal, we come to you today representing our different nations, our families, as one community of believers whose faith is in your Son Jesus Christ alone. We extol you, O God, our King. We bless your name for the greatness of your kingdom, for you alone are worthy to be praised. Thank you, dear God, for your love, for your mercy, compassion, healing, and forgiveness. Thank you, Lord, that you are slow to anger and full of grace. Thank you, Lord, that you sustain us all when we fall and raise us all up when we humble ourselves before you. Today, we proclaim your majesty for our countries, our families, for our businesses, and in all the pillars of our societies. We thank you, O God, for your faithfulness and immeasurable love for all of us. In the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, we say, Amen.
Please all rise for the Philippine National Anthem. Welcome to the Asia CEO Forum Philippines Online Edition, highlighting leadership excellence. Please welcome your host, Mr. Richard Mills.
Good morning, everyone. This is Richard Mills, your host for Asia CEO Forum. And we have a special speaker today, and it's a special time, a very challenging one, and like something that none of us have experienced in most of our lifetime. So to try to make some sense of this and where the economy is going, where our jobs is going, our businesses, much at stake right now, our schools, everything is up in the air. We're going to have a very special guest today, only one speaker, Dr. Bernie Villegas. He's been speaking with us for years, and he speaks with many people. He sits on boards of some of the nation's premier organizations, and certainly is a regular called upon advisor to organizations and governments for many years in the country's history. So we're really pleased to have him, and just him today, to talk about the economy and the health and wealth of Filipinos. So really glad to have Dr. Bernie Villegas. He is what I consider to be the nation's most important economist. So we're really, really pleased to have him. And I am anxiously looking forward to what he has to say. And then we're going to have a very engaging question and answer period afterwards. So please think of your questions along his message, and we'll look forward to a very engaging time during the question and answer. So please welcome to the screen, Dr. Bernie Villegas, to tell us about the economy in Philippines and way out and beyond. Please welcome Bernie. How are you, Bernie?
Very well. Thank you very much, Richard. Greetings to all from Manila. You know, if there's one takeaway that I would like all of you to keep in mind, it is this phrase. In these very uncertain times, we have to focus on lasting trends instead of getting distracted by temporary blips. I cannot in any way speak with certainty about the next 12 to 18 months. In fact, I'm amused at how economists, no matter how sophisticated their tools are literally guessing about what's going to happen to the world economy, regional economy, and national economy in the next 12 to 18 months. For example, in the second quarter of this year, the final figure for GDP was a minus 16.5 decline. Do you know, just before the government announced the statistics, there was a range of forecasts from private economists from minus 2.3 to minus 23. Just imagine how people are literally guessing. And I cannot blame them, because everything now depends on what happens to coronavirus. And no one can say with certainty that a vaccine will be found. And when it is found, it will be distributed widely all over the world. And whether or not in the next 12 to 18 months, there will be more and more surges, second, third, and fourth waves. As we're seeing, even the best countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea are having second, third surges of COVID-19. So therefore, my purpose is to focus on what we can call the lasting trends that the Philippine economy faces. That we, whatever happens, will continue to be known, and I'm going to present evidence, as one of the most promising emerging markets, not only in Indo-Pacific, but in the whole world over the next 10 to 20 years. And I'm assuming that the majority of you who are listening to me expect to be around at least in the next 5 to 10 years. So it's very logical that you will think of at least the next 5 to 10 years. The first lasting trend, it's very obvious, is what I refer to as our geographical advantage. No matter how virulent the virus may be, there is one thing that we can foresee with certainty, that the Philippines will be in the epicenter of the most dynamic economic region in the world over the next 10 to 20 years. Take a look at what we have in the slide here. As many of you, I'm sure, remember, the last century was referred to by economists as the American century. There was no doubt that the US, together with Europe and Japan, lorded it over the global economy. There were three territories that were competing for dominance. But it was labeled as the American century because the US was indeed the leader. This century is now being called the Asian century, with reason. Just take a look at the bottom tables. These days, just before the pandemic, countries in the so-called American century, the US, Eurozone, and Japan, were struggling to grow between 0.8% to 2.9%. And there is no reason to expect that after the pandemic, they can surpass those growth rates. They are mature. Most of them are aging societies, and that is why they are now on the decline. Take a look at the three territories making up the Asian century: China, India, and the ASEAN Economic Community, represented by ASEAN 5 leading ASEAN countries, which you will see later on. Their growth rates before the pandemic were anywhere from 2 to 3 times those of the countries of the American century. And that trend will continue because we are just beginning our emerging into the global economy. And I'm sure you've noticed that China is the only country now registering a positive growth, as all the countries, especially in the Western world, are suffering devastating declines of anywhere from 10 to 12%. And the Philippines is very fortunate because we are literally at the epicenter of this most dynamic region, which fortunately is not suffering from the economic disease of protectionism. America first, Brexit, these countries are beginning to renounce globalization. They're beginning to be anti-trade, while countries in the 18th century are still very open to one another, especially the ASEAN Economic Community, which precisely is made up of 10 countries that are determined to be the next Eurozone. And that is definitely a lasting trend that the Philippines will count on. I just wanted to remind all of you that more than 15 years ago, an economist from Goldman Sachs by the name of Jim O'Neill coined the phrase BRIC to represent Brazil, Russia, India, China. At that time, this economist looked into the future and saw that these four countries would dominate the global economy over the next 2 decades. Unfortunately, Brazil and Russia fell along the way because they mismanaged their economies, at least for a while. And so only India and China really are left from the original BRIC. And now we add the ASEAN. And now you have precisely these three territories that make up the Asian century. Just as an aside, South Africa was added by the BRIC leaders just for political correctness, but you can see for yourself that the figures of South Africa are very far from the figures of BRIC. The same economist, Tim O'Neill, added 11 other countries, which he referred to as the emerging engines of growth, also for the next decades. And it is very revealing that there are only 3 ASEAN countries included in this next 11. And some of you have heard me before coin the acronym VIP, not very important person, but Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, which are the only 3 countries included in this list. Indeed, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines will dominate the ASEAN in the coming years because they are very large in their population, very rich in resources, and going through the evolution of a low middle income economy to an upper middle economy, which is the period in which demand for all types of consumer goods and services will be literally exploding based on their respective domestic markets, which make them not as dependent on external trade as small countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, even Thailand. Now, this is the most recent assessment of the Oxford Economics Group, which is a very prestigious think tank. So this is an independent assessment of economies all over the world. And surprise, surprise, the Philippines is number 2 among the 10 leading emerging markets that will dominate global economy in the next decade, according to the economists of Oxford Economics Group. It's very telling that Indonesia is number 3 and China is only number 4. I think China is not number 1 because China is already suffering from demographic suicide. It is aging so fast, even though they have a very large population. The number of people who are over 65 are a big percentage of the population, and they're having now difficulties having their young labor force take care of their senior citizens. In fact, I know that there are already groups in China looking at how to import Filipino teachers in English, Filipino nurses, and so on and so forth. And so here is another evidence. Again, I repeat, this is not a self-serving, propagandistic information coming from the Philippine government or even from so-called prophet of boom like me. It is an independent assessment of our prospects. The most recent, already during the pandemic, complementary assessment of our economy came from The Economist. And these are selected emerging economists ranked on 4 measures of financial strength, and the Philippines is number 6, surpassing Thailand, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam. So these are very strong economies, Indonesia. So take a look at the countries that we surpass. Now, why do I think The Economist thinks highly of the Philippines as regards financial strength? My explanation is that over at least the last 3 administrations, so this is not something that can be attributed only to the Duterte government, at least since the time of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, our financial managers have been very responsible in keeping our fiscal deficit under control, below 3% of GDP, and our debt to GDP ratio at very manageable levels, between 30 to 40%. Just for you to know how this is very manageable, debt to GDP ratios in countries like the United States are close to 100, Italy more than 100, Spain more than 100. So 30 to 40% debt to GDP ratio is a very responsible ratio, which is providentially helping us now during this emergency to borrow a lot without endangering the stability of the economy. And that's exactly what the Philippine government is doing. It's borrowing so that it can subsidize the poor, it can subsidize small and medium-scale industries, and it can pump the economy with huge infrastructure projects, which will help us overcome the slowdown, the decline because of the pandemic. Here, this is coming from Hong Kong Shanghai Bank more than 50 years ago. Again, these are all long-term trends. This may be old data, but I'm emphasizing the fact that these are forecasts made when the world was normal, economists were thinking of lasting trends, and were not being distracted by, I repeat, temporary blips. And take a look at what Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, which used to be very critical of the Philippines, who were called by Hong Kong Shanghai Bank the sick man of Asia for years and years, especially during the time of Marcos and immediately after. But take a look at this list. According to a very long-term prognostication, the Philippines will be number 16 in the world in GDP, surpassing Indonesia, Australia, Argentina, Malaysia, the Netherlands, and that's no mean feat. So here again, an evidence that over the long run, the Philippines is one of the most attractive economies in which to invest. The most recent assessment came from the Japan Credit Rating Agency. We were upgraded from BBB plus to A minus. Again, because of what they saw in our macroeconomic stability. And we also, I forgot to mention that we also have one of the best central banking systems in Asia. Our central bank is constantly rated as one of the best. And indeed, the results are there. Central bank easily addressed the hyperinflation that we experienced in 2018. In no time at all, from 6% rate of inflation, which was worrisome, they were able to bring it with their monetary tools to 2 to 3%. And they're being kept at that level because we have already built a very strong institution manned by very professional managers, and we have a very big pool of these technocrats whether in our finance department or in monetary sector, that we really don't care who the next president will be. The institutions are there. When some people are anxious, they don't know what the political succession will be. I don't care as regards economic management. We have a large pool of very professional managers, and our institutions have already been established that they will continue doing a good job, whoever is the political leader of this country. Let me now just summarize what I've been saying and add a few more. So, in addition to the so-called geographic dividend that I referred to, our being right smack in the middle of the most dynamic economic region in the world, we have our demographic dividend. We're one of the few emerging markets in the world today that still have young, growing, in our case, English-speaking populations. As you know, most of the countries in Northeast Asia, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and I mentioned China, are already suffering from demographic decline. We are still growing, and we will have that demographic dividend at least for the next 20 years. And that gives us a tremendous leeway to send millions of our workers to service these aging populations I referred to. As probably you know, we have more than 10 million of our overseas workers remitting more than $30 billion to the economy, representing anywhere from 10 to 12% of our GDP. And in fact, even in the midst of this pandemic, remittances are still growing, despite the fact that 600,000 workers had to come back because they were laid off, especially in the Middle East. In June, remittances began to increase again by all the people, especially land-based workers who are still there and who became extra generous in sending remittances to the relatives because they knew that the relatives were in trouble. And that is a long-lasting asset that we have, thanks to our young, growing, and English-speaking population. Another tremendous advantage of this demographic dividend is that we are, together with India, the center of BPO IT services in the world. Our business process outsourcing IT sector employs 1.2 million young workers, earning $25 billion, although that has slowed down. I have no doubt that the moment the world recovers, in fact, a lot of the companies abroad trying to grow again will definitely cut their costs and will actually tend to outsource more and more of their business services to India and the Philippines. So I see that sector as the one that will have a V shape in recovery. And the third tremendous advantage of a young growing population is that our 110 million Filipinos, they are the first source of economic growth in our country. Our GDP growth is mostly propelled by consumption. A young growing population tends to consume a lot more than an aging population. And we will have that for some time to come. In fact, the reason why our economy took a plunge of 16.5% is that our population has not been able to spend because they have been locked down for more than 5 months. That's the main reason. People have not been going to the malls, they have not been going on domestic tourism and so on and so forth. But the moment there is more freedom of movement, I can bet that Filipinos will once again be consuming like anything and will once again be the source of high growth. I already described geographic dividend. Now let me just talk about the temporal dividend. We are growing in the right place at the right time. What do I mean by the right time? That our economy is transitioning from a low middle income level to an upper middle income level, just in terms of figures, that's going from below $4,000 per capita to between $4,000 per capita to $10,000 capita, which is the trajectory that we will be having in the next 10 years. And any economist would know that that specific transition, using what is known as Engel's law, produces a huge increase in expenditures on discretionary items, meaning not the basic goods of food, shelter, and clothing, but all types of consumer goods and services that are the stuff out of which an industrial economy is made of. And that is exactly what we will be doing in the next 10 to 20 years, transitioning from low middle income level to upper middle income level. We still have a lot of abundant natural resources, especially as regards tourism. Remember, we have 7,000 and more islands. And the first recovery of tourism will not be foreign tourism. I don't expect foreign tourism to recover in the next 2 years. But what will recover will be the 60 million Filipinos who before the pandemic were traveling out of their home to the many tourism destinations that we have. Probably some of you know that recently an international travel magazine rated Palawan in southern Philippines as the best resort island in the whole world. And for your information, Palawan is made up of 2,000 islands. In fact, as I see it, because people are discovering Palawan, first of all, Filipinos themselves. Palawan will be developed with better infrastructure. In fact, it's the only island that will have 3 international airports, one in Coron, one in Puerto Princesa, and the third one in San Vicente. It definitely has a chance to compete with Bali. Unfortunately, Bali in Indonesia has all the natural calamities you can think of. They have earthquakes, they have tsunamis, they have volcanoes. Palawan doesn't have any of those. So our tourism definitely can recover quickly, but on the basis of 60 million of us traveling out of our home to these many destinations. Now, fortunately, the government has enough resources. As I said, they can borrow without endangering our fiscal stability. Build, and that will continue into at least the next 2 administrations. Build is not going to be limited to President Duterte's government, but at least the next 2 presidents will have to continue this important way we can be at the same level as our neighbors. Anyone who has traveled to Taiwan, to Korea, not to mention Japan and China would know, and not to mention even Vietnam. Vietnam is surpassing us in infrastructure. Would know that we just have to build a lot more infrastructures, especially in the countryside. Now, one good news that is specific to this period of our growth is that there are now a number of regions in the Philippines that are growing faster than Manila. So Manila is no longer the center of industrialization and growth in our country. You have areas, first of all, south of Manila, especially the province of Batangas, which is a very good international port. Then central Luzon, where you have Clark and Subic, built by the Americans when they still had their bases here, now becoming a new metropolis. In the Visayas, Iloilo is a city that is already a smart city in terms of infrastructure. In fact, all the big real estate developers are busy putting up projects in Iloilo. Cebu and Manila are in the same situation. Both of them are congested and very difficult really to resolve. The problem of traffic and pollution and so on and so forth. So we need new metropolitan areas. And in Mindanao, Davao is the contender, together with another international port city called Cagayan de Oro. So that is definitely a great advantage that investors will find. They no longer have to come to Manila. They can spread out into the regions of the Philippines and find better environments in which to invest. Obviously, we have long-term challenges. And the first important challenge is we have very low agricultural productivity, especially compared to our peers like Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam. That is a result of decades of neglect by governments of countryside in agricultural development. But that is changing. We're fortunate we now have a very competent Secretary of Agriculture, William Dar, who's laying the foundation for a long-term solution to this problem. We still have too many obstacles to doing business, as I'm sure Richard, who's an expat, knows. I'm sure many of his friends complain. Too much red tape, especially at the local government level. Too many restrictions found in our own constitution about limits to investment from foreigners. In fact, as you know, Vietnam is a lot more open. Vietnam is still a communist country, but it's still more open to foreigners than the Philippines. We have to address that. And I'm very much at the forefront because I was part of the group that wrote the Constitution under Cory Aquino. And I'm the first one to point out that we made our mistake putting too many restrictions in our Constitution against foreign direct investments. I don't have any illusion that we will be able to change the Constitution in the remaining years of Duterte, but I'm optimistic that in the next administration, in the first year or so, there will be enough demand for changes that we may be able to change those restrictions. The irony of our manpower situation is that despite our having many young people, we have a shortage of technical skills. You know, in this construction boom, we are finding shortage of carpenters, plumbers, electricians, mechanics. The reason is socio-cultural. Parents and young people here still are so obsessed with a college diploma, very much influenced by the American mentality. Very different from Europe, where for years, the youth did not go to universities but went to technical schools. In our country, there is a tremendous bias against blue-collar work, against using one's hands. There are a number of us who are trying to address that, and hopefully, by putting up very prestigious technical schools that turn out carpenters, mechanical workers, and so on and so forth, we will be able to convince young people that it is as prestigious and as economically rewarding to be a plumber as to be an accountant. That's a challenge, but we are doing everything to change that mentality. We still have very high rates of electricity, probably next only to Japan. But the good news is practically all the big conglomerates are investing in power plants. The bad news for the environmentalists is that coal is going to be with us for many years, decades to come. Because to bring down the rates of electricity, coal is still the cheapest source. Corruption and poor governance, I think we will have that for a long time to come. There are efforts to change that. In fact, right now, probably you've read how much corruption there has been in our health department. You know, all the money that's going into health, that's a temptation for the corrupt people. My only consolation, and just to lighten our discussion, is that I look at South Korea. South Korea is a first world country, but South Korea has not yet eliminated corruption. And just for those of you who want to know a little about this, just watch the famous Korean telenovela called Crash Landing on You. No? So just to give a little entertainment. If you watch that television series in Netflix, you will see that both North and South Korea are still full of corruption. We have high frequency of natural calamities, and there's nothing to do except to be prepared.
Key in your questions, comments, and suggestions via the chat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bernie Villegas. So we'll now go to our question and answer session. So please get online and send us questions, and we'll see what we can get answers for. Bernie, very good, very good information, and it's always inspirational to me. You know, I like a positive message, and I have to watch myself. I don't get too carried away. There's always challenges, like you said. So I'm glad you included that challenges page in your presentation. But let's go through some of the questions that we've had from others and that we've had for ourselves. So the first question, you talked a bit about the recovery. You know, I read in the news that the Philippine economy had, and I think you had mentioned, dropped by about 16% or so. And, you know, all countries are going through this, many worse, as you know. But they're more and more talking about a V recovery, so a fast recovery. In other words, some say a U recovery, some say a no recovery. So could you just expand on that for Philippines? What do you think is going to be the, what's the recovery going to look like in Philippines?
You know, Richard, I think it's meaningless to talk about a V recovery, an L recovery, a W recovery for the whole economy. It's meaningless because there will be sectors that don't need to recover because they have been growing even during the pandemic. There will be sectors that will have a V recovery, definitely. Sectors that will never recover. Sectors whose businesses are going to be closed, definitely. So let me tell you which are the so-called sunrise industries that are already recovering or will have a V recovery. And later on, those that are going to take a long time to recover, an L recovery. There are four under the sunrise sectors. Number one is anything to do with food and agribusiness. This pandemic has finally impressed on the minds of everyone that food security is a must, and that we have to do something about the whole value chain of agribusiness. When I talk about agribusiness, I'm not speaking only of farming. I'm speaking of post-harvest, cold storage, processing, logistics, and so on and so forth. And that's a whole chain that, in fact, if you take a look at the stock market of the Philippines, the biggest companies, San Miguel, Robina, Century Can, and so on and so forth, are all part of that business. That doesn't need a recovery because it has been probably the only economy sector that has been growing a lot. No? Second, and it's very obvious with what you and I are doing, Zoom. So anything that has to do with the digital world, the so-called fourth industrial revolution. You know, Zoom has become one of the most precious assets right now in the stock market, and many others that definitely will go through a V-shaped recovery, if at all. Probably the part of Zoom that has to recover a little is I'll refer to the BPO IT. Because of the lockdowns, it was difficult for some of these companies to operate. But the moment people can again go to their offices and they don't have to stay in hotels, etc., we will see a real recovery of BPO IT in the Philippines. The third one, again, no-brainer. Anything that has to do with health and wellness. Not only pharmaceutical products, but clinics, hospitals, and also anything to do with preventive, increasing the immunity of people. People will be very conscious about exercise, about taking the right food, and so on and so forth. So anything to do with health and wellness is definitely going to recover very fast. And the last one is anything to do with skills development. Not only education that we call formal, leading to degrees, but all sorts of non-formal, informal education. People now see how important it is to make learning a lifetime process because technology is changing so fast to become obsolete the moment you graduate from any course. So education is definitely going to recover very fast. The ones that are going to be unfortunate will take at least 2 years to see any recovery would be travel and tourism, except for domestic tourism. Anything that has to do with restaurants, dining out, etc., I think as long as the virus is there, and the virus will still be there even if we find a vaccine. I want to remind that people of that. We have a vaccine for ordinary flu for decades. We still have the flu coming back every season. Filipinos are very sociable, but I think they will think twice before going back to the same level of sociability as before the pandemic. Those are the industries that, for anything related to fashion, very expensive luxury items, even luxury cars and so on and so forth, those will not recover fast. They are the ones who are going through the L-shaped recovery.
Bernie, a lot of people point to kind of 3 shock absorber sectors, and you talk about them a lot. One is the OFW, Overseas Foreign Workers Remittances. You mentioned around $30 billion per year or more that's being sent. Also, the IT BPO sector that employs upwards of 1.5 million people these days, a fantastic success. And then I would also add a more recent sector resulting from the Chinese investing heavily in Philippines. Now, you've talked about the IT BPO sector, and yeah, I think that's a good point. It should come back strongly. But can you expand on the OFW market? How can remittances remain strong if so many people are losing their jobs? And also about the Chinese. Did you consider them important, their investment, or are we not treating them well? Are they all going to go back home? What's your views on those?
First of all, as far as overseas workers, even now, in the depth of the pandemic, I know groups from Germany and Japan sending language instructors, teaching nurses, caregivers, construction workers their respective languages, because they know that they are going to be very short of workers. And that's why they want Filipinos to speak their languages. So which means they're poised to actually import a lot of Filipinos. No longer the low-level domestic helpers, but professionals, nurses, health workers, IT workers, and so on and so forth. That's where I think the recovery will be, in the BPO IT. In the BPO, the contact centers are the ones that are threatened by artificial intelligence and robotization. The voice-oriented centers can easily be mechanized. And that is why I see the industry association very wise in retraining a lot of their call center agents in knowledge process outsourcing, no longer voice-oriented. And that requires, of course, giving them critical thinking skills, ability to communicate better, and understanding of different sciences. I think, you should know because you're in Canada, TELUS is doing that already. They are seeing the future that call center enterprises will be limited, but knowledge process outsourcing is unlimited. So that's the way the transition will be in the BPO IT sector. Then overseas workers definitely will always be in demand because the demographic problem of advanced countries is impossible to reverse. I know of no country, they said France, but I even doubt. I think France reversed it by having a lot of Muslims, with all due respect. But I think there's very difficult to reverse a low fertility rate. So that's our advantage. We have all the young people to provide for these countries.
We've seen a lot of Chinese investment in the economy lately, Bernie, and the government has supported it and so forth. Do you think this will be a factor, or are we not treating them very well and they're going to go home?
The Chinese are not here in a big way. The Chinese are very poor in delivering. So that's why Duterte has learned his lesson. So in the beginning of his presidency, he said he was going to shift away from the US, but he shifted too much towards China, thinking that China will be our savior. He has realized that the Chinese have their own financial problems. The Chinese financial system is in trouble. They allow their banks to lend too much to their state enterprises, and their non-performing loans are very high. So they really cannot afford to finance other countries. The only reason why sometimes they appear to be very eager to finance third world countries is political. But in fact, we have seen a rebalancing in the last 2 years. That now, thanks to the more enlightened members of his cabinet, they are now balancing China with the power of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. These three countries have as much money and as much experience in infrastructure. In fact, if you take a look at the big infrastructures that they began, they're not Chinese. The train from Clark to Manila is Japanese. The subway in Metro Manila is Japanese. I know of very few real Chinese big infrastructures. So that's definitely the fact. Now, in terms of private investments of Chinese companies together with local companies, I think the biggest one is the grid, the electric grid, the national transmission grid. And then you now have the impending, but it's still a big question, the new telecom company, Dito. That's also, but again, we still have to see whether or not they really will be able to compete with PLDT and Globe, no? So, and the biggest presence really of the Chinese here is, as you very well know, Pogo, the online gaming. So there are hundreds of thousands of them around, and I welcome their presence. So as long as we're able to address the criminal elements among them, no? As you know, the people who kidnap one another. But I welcome their presence because they do not really take jobs from Filipinos, because you have to be excellent in Mandarin to be able to service the clients in China. So they do add to our economy by renting a lot of these condominium units, offices. In fact, there will be a crisis in real estate if they all disappear. And I don't think they will disappear. So this is the Chinese presence.
Okay, that's good. Okay, that makes it easy to understand. And yes, we do like the Chinese. I gotta say that there's bad ones, but it seems the bad ones are going home and just the good ones are here now. So any Chinese guys listening, you're welcome in Philippines, and Filipinos like you.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm glad you said that. We are definitely going to engage the Chinese more and more, because there's no question, China will be the most important economy in Asia Pacific for a long time. And they already have 700 million middle-income Chinese who are tremendous markets for any good that we can provide for them. Right now, we're providing very limited goods like bananas, pineapples, but we can do so much more if we, for example, shift our agriculture away from low-priced products like rice, corn, towards more and more high-priced fruits and vegetables. China is going to be like a sponge getting all of these high-value products, because China cannot be self-sufficient. The biggest fear of China is food security. So we have to be very close to the Chinese in terms of trade.
True. And they're nice people too, so they deserve, I know it makes me upset when you see them getting ripped off or something, but they're a nice group and it's nice to have them here. Okay, now Bernie, the private sector, you mentioned some of the big companies, San Miguel, Ayala Corp, and so forth. What are they doing to support their employees and the nation's economy? We're hearing some good things, but what are you hearing? Are they a factor, or are they just sitting around doing nothing?
Oh, definitely. They are very generous now, not only in making sure that their employees are protected against the pandemic, both sustaining their salaries, but putting up billions of facilities for example, the patients of COVID-19 who cannot be accommodated in hospitals, the Ayalas, San Miguel's, they're actually putting up facilities, converting some of our large convention centers, for example, into areas where you can keep some of the less serious patients. And they're contributing PPEs, the physical protective equipment. So they definitely have been very generous with their pockets in addressing the problems of the poor people in the pandemic. So the so-called corporate social responsibility is no longer just a slogan, it's happening. These large corporations are showing that they're not practicing the wrong kind of capitalism, where the only concern is profit, profit, profit. They're very concerned about the other so-called stakeholders of every business, starting with their employees, of course, and their customers.
Okay, that's good to hear. We're hearing the same thing, so I'm glad to hear you're hearing the same thing. Now, Bernie, if I could ask you a delicate question, but we've heard about the private sector. What do you think the Philippines government's capability or achievement has been in helping Filipinos, both keeping them safe and healthy, and the economic situation? How do you think Philippines compares to other countries? What can you say?
Unfortunately, that's an area where I cannot rank the Philippine response as among the best. I think we have not put really the right managers in the health sector. I mean, Duterte has been appointing too many military people. They may be honest, I'm not questioning, but they know very little about the industry, about management, and so on and so forth. And so many of their responses have not been based on science and on experience of health people. We should have had better professionals to run the response to the pandemic. And I think that's where we definitely can improve the situation.
Now, Bernie, you mentioned, and I'm reading big concerns about debt levels in many countries, especially the Western countries, it seems, are going really over the top at least from a debt service perspective. What is the Philippine debt situation like how does Philippines compare to other countries? What do you see with that?
Very well, not only with developed countries, but with its neighbors. As I said, historically, over the last 10 years at least, our debt to GDP ratio has been at a low of 30 to 40%. You mentioned other countries, 100% is very normal in these developed countries. So they borrow 100% of the GDP. We have not done that. And that's why we can bring our debt to GDP ratio as high as 70%, which is quite a lot, without going into the danger zone. And it's happening. Our government, because it has no other recourse but to borrow in order to be able to support all of these poor people, in order to pump the economy. So it's doing that. In fact, there are economists who are saying that the government is not even doing enough. I just read the column of very prominent economist, Winnie Monsod, who really saying, as a percentage of GDP, what the government is spending is peanuts compared to Indonesia, compared to other countries. So there are two sides, no? So there are some people who say, let's be a little more prudent, but the other says, okay, don't worry about high debt ratios at this stage, no? What you have to do is think of the poor. Of course, there's going to be a balancing act. But fortunately, we have a lot of leeway to increase our debt to GDP ratio.
Yes, it is a balancing act. It's very difficult. If there's government people listening, please understand that we understand that is a very difficult time, and what exactly it should do is very difficult. Now, Bernie, the national capital region of Philippines dominates the economy of the nation, but there's other regions. You mentioned Cebu, Davao, Iloilo, the Palawan, and so forth. Can you tell us a bit more? How are they doing through all this? I mean, is there adequate internet, power, infrastructure services in these areas? And are their growth rates different from the NCR? What do you understand?
Oh, definitely. Their growth rates are different from the NCR. Just to give you an idea, over the last 5 years, NCR has been growing at 4%, while the whole economy was growing at 6%. But Davao has been growing at 8%. Batangas has been growing at 8%. Central Luzon has been growing at 7%. So you see that the NCR is being left behind in terms of growth, which means that there are a lot now of investments that are flowing away from Manila, also because of government policy. For example, You cannot put up a PEZA, export processing zone, or BPO in Manila within a certain area. But the incentives remain if you put it in Iloilo or in Puerto Princesa or in Pampanga. So that is also another reason why investors are avoiding Manila. They don't get incentives anymore to put certain investments in Manila. And that's a good thing. My own bet is Batangas. Batangas will be another Manila sooner than the others because Batangas already has the infrastructure. And the governor of Batangas is very forward-looking. It's planning even additional infrastructures, a railway from Calamba to the port of Batangas that will serve as cargo transport for all those hundreds of factories lining the corridor. And they're going to put an airport like Ramon Ang is putting up in Bulacan, somewhere in Batangas, also for cargo. So in the next 5 years, you will see Batangas really transforming its infrastructure to really attract investments away from Metro Manila. And the other one that I already mentioned is the so-called Pampanga Triangle, San Fernando, Angeles, Clark, and Subic. Put all those together, you have, in fact, in terms of industrialization, more attractive areas than Metro Manila. Metro Manila is too congested for factories to be put up.
Okay, Bernie, that's very exciting. Okay, so outside the main region. Now, and connecting to these locations takes us to the build infrastructure program of the Duterte administration. The pandemic has slowed down these things. Is this going to be able to get back on track, and will it add to the country's economic recovery?
Oh, definitely. I think we're beginning to see now that we are in GCQ, no longer the very strict lockdown. You see many of these infrastructure projects reopening. And one very positive thing I see is that Mark Villar's budget is spent mostly in the countryside, not in Metro Manila. So the money that the government has for infrastructure, they're making sure will go to improving farm-to-market roads, irrigation systems, and things that will favor the farmers. Their idea is if Manila wants better LRTs, better skyways, let Manny Pangilinan, Ramon Ang, all these PPP partners do it. And I think that's a very good division of labor. Government money should be spent in areas where the poor are. There's no question that the poor are in rural areas. You see that also in Mindanao and in the other areas. So I think as long as that policy is kept, we will see more and more productivity in the rural areas. And that is, as I said, our number one problem. We have the lowest productivity in agriculture in the region.
I know we've had a lot of messages online, so we really appreciate your time spending with us, and I know you're hearing from different countries what's going on, so it was really good. And so I think the message is, Bernie, is it fair to say we have an optimistic view of things, and that we're going to have a difficulty in the short run, but longer term it seems to look very positive. That's a fair thing to say, I would think, Bernie?
Well, I must say that we are presenting this message to investors who are local or foreign who can think of making long-term investments. If investors are interested in quick returns, they're not the ones we are talking to. Because, as I said, in the short term, in the next 12 to 18 months, we cannot guarantee that the Philippines will be attractive for them. But if they are really entrepreneurs who think within a horizon of 5 to 10 years, there's no question that all over the world, the Philippines is one of the most attractive places to invest. And I repeat, I'm not the one saying it, it's all those international think tanks and institutions whose data I presented earlier.
Okay, Bernie. Well, thank you again, Bernie. And we'll see you soon, and look forward to your positive messages always.
And I hope you and Rebecca will come soon to Manila. You're missing a lot.
Thank you to our speaker for today. Please welcome Ms. Rebecca Bustamante for the closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bernie, for sharing very good information, being positive all the time for Philippines, for our country. It's so inspiring. And of course, to all our viewers, thank you for joining, and please share the information that Dr. Bernie shared, because that will give a lot of information to boost our country. Maraming salamat, and we would like to invite you on our next event on September 17. It's called Real Estate Forum. And listen again to all top speakers, what's happening in our country. And again, despite of the pandemic, we are continuously growing for Philippines. Maraming salamat at mabuhay.
In 2014, we were part of the emerging Asia. In 2015, we excelled in solidarity. In 2016, we went to the future. In 2017, we were the global center of growth. In 2018, we helped build the country. In 2019, we stood on the shoulders of giants. In 2020, we are united towards First World. This is the Asia CEO Awards 2020, United Towards First World.